Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be talking about a topic that's very much in the news these days, and that is the subject of data. Lots and lots of data. Who collects it, how they collect it, why they collect it, and whether it's good or bad or both. Our guest tonight is Professor Bamshad Mobasher from DePaul University, and I know DePaul likes to refer to you as a data scientist. So, Professor Mobasher, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Nice to be here.
So let's start with the basics. Data is everywhere. We seem to be collecting it from everything from our cell phones to our cars to our refrigerators and our thermostats and our web pages. So what's driving all this collection of data, and who's collecting it and why?
Well, I mean, technology is driving it. It used to be much harder to collect this kind of data. Somebody had to write it down someplace. If you went to a store and bought something, somebody would write it down in some kind of a ledger. Maybe at some point they would put it in some kind of a spreadsheet. But now a lot of these processes are automated. So there's a lot more sensors. Every piece of machinery has sensors. There are millions of sensors, I'm exaggerating, but there are literally dozens of sensors just in the mobile device that you're carrying.
And there are probably millions we encounter throughout our daily lives.
Probably in one day. You may take the train. You're probably going to be on half a dozen cameras. The train itself has other kinds of sensors that's constantly collecting the data. Your phone is collecting data as you're moving around. And there's all sorts of other gadgets and devices, our cars. You go to work and you sit on your computer, and again, you're generating data. So all of this data there is a lot more data that's being generated by individuals, not just by organizations and for scientific purposes, but by every single individual.
And much of this is willingly contributed, right? I mean, people buy cell phones, they load apps that track their location, that track their time of day, that track their mood, that track whatever they track. And people are willingly doing this, right? So all this data is being collected because we as individuals are now contributing this data into some vast set of databases.
So I'm not sure psychologically people understand the scope. So they certainly understand that, okay, I'm downloading this app right now and it's going to do these things. And okay, for this I might give up a little bit of my privacy or allow this app to use certain portions of my data. But when you combine that with all of the other apps and all of the other things outside of those apps, outside of your control, that are collecting data about you in different ways, I'm not sure people really have a good sense of the amount of data that you're allowing to be collected about you in different ways.
And in fact, what I have come to understand is that even when you try to keep this anonymous, or even when sites say they won't collect your name, there are certain things they won't collect about you, nonetheless, it doesn't take a whole lot of so-called anonymous data points to construct an image and know that it's you or it's me, that it's almost impossible to be anonymous in this vast world of data collection.
Yes, I think I think people have a false sense of security in terms of anonymity. That notion of anonymity no longer really exists, unless you're truly living off the grid and you have no credit cards and no
cell phone
devices, no cell phones, no Kindle, no nothing else. And then maybe you can somewhat remain anonymous. Even then, there are probably satellites watching over you. But the notion of anonymity, even if you're not necessarily entering your information in terms of personal information in some website, let's say, or some device, some app that you're using at the moment, there is enough things that can connect different pieces of your behavior that it's possible to at least profile you in a very relatively accurate way.
And most of these things are done for what I would say is generally, they're not for nefarious purposes.
No.
This is really just to collect the data because it's there and because it can be collected.
And it's potentially useful. I mean, it could be useful for a variety of different reasons. Companies certainly would like to collect this kind of data because understanding your behavior, understanding what kinds of things you might like, would allow them to try to offer you something at the right time, in the right place, and something that you might actually be interested in, not just some random, advertising that's coming to you. So, but that's coming at the cost of you allowing these companies to really connect a lot of different channels through which you're really emitting data.
Now, one of the things that and as you know, I follow this subject somewhat myself, and so one of the things I have seen is that the idea of contributing data, which we all are now doing wittingly or unwittingly, though can benefit us as well. If we think about the medical world, for example, if we have Fitbits or we have whatever other sensors we want to attach to ourselves, then we have constant monitoring of our bodies, which could be very useful in later either diagnosing problems or in seeing that a problem is developing before it becomes serious. So by feeding all this data in, there are some upsides that we could experience as individuals, correct?
Absolutely. So let's use the example you mentioned, Fitbits. That kind of sensory data that is constantly being collected about your vital signs, about your activities, the ability to be able to correlate your activities or your inactivity for that matter with the different kinds of vital signs, and then being able to correlate that with other people's data who may have different kinds of activities or different kind of conditions and different kinds of disposition, and being able to correlate that yet with maybe the medical knowledge that exists allows us to do tremendous kinds of things, right? You might be able to have the intelligent devices that, much earlier than, medical system cannot do to diagnose certain kinds of, diseases, even possibly maybe be able to predict that you're maybe in risk of certain kinds of diseases unless you do certain kinds of change your behavior, let's say, in certain ways. And the ability to do that, I think, gives you tremendous power to some extent. But on the other hand, there is a price to be paid for that as well, right? So all of these technologies can be used in a way that could benefit people. But you can imagine maybe an insurance company wanting to use that as a way to jack up, let's say, premiums on a particular individual because of their predicted, the prediction that they might, for example,
in fact,
have some disease.
At that point, speaking of insurance, it kind of invalidates the entire insurance business model, which is to say, we don't know what's going to happen to any one of us, so we all share this common risk and we'll all contribute. Some people will pay more and get less. Some people will get more and pay less because that's how how it will work out. But once we know individually,
that's right,
then that whole model begins to break down. So the concept of insurance becomes something that has to be rethought. That's
true. I think a lot of concepts, like that would have to be rethought given the kind of data now being collected. I mean, if you think about it, one example in staying within the medical domain, just by analyzing Twitter feeds, for example, people have been able to predict the outbreak of certain kinds of communicable diseases like common cold or flu and so on, much faster than CDC can. Right? And in fact, CDC is now using these kinds of technologies by just looking at things like Twitter feeds, looking at search queries on Google, for example. And, this is, it seems fairly simple, but actually it gives you an advantage that we didn't have before. And that's an example of, by the way, using big data, right?
Right.
Because that's the kind of thing that won't work with small data.
And now to describe it, most people have no idea what that is. Big data, does that mean a number that's really long? People have no idea what we're talking about when we say big data.
Well, I mean, part of the problem with the phrase big data is that it's now become kind of a buzzword. So once something, takes the status of a buzzword, it starts losing its meaning. But to a data scientist, when you're talking about big data, it's not just about the volume of the data. It's about data that's extremely unstructured, the data that's in terms of location everywhere, data that's very dynamic and potentially changing, and of course the volume of the data. So particularly when you're dealing with data that's social in nature.
So like Facebook or Twitter, some of these social feeds, right?
Data that's the result of aggregation of data points by many, many different individuals in social settings, right? Social networks is an example of that. looking at the query logs or queries that people type in, search terms that they might type in on Google. Lots and millions of people, or maybe billions of people, in fact, across the world would do. That's the example of big data. And once you are able to look at the data at that scale and aggregate the data at that scale, then you see things that it's not really possible to see in any other way, right? You can see the data come to life in some respect, because it's really an ecosystem, right? When you look at, if you look at, for example, just the flight patterns of
U.S. flights?
Just U.S. flights or internationally, if you look at it over time and visualize it, you will see some patterns emerge. You can understand, for example, when it's in time of the night or it's time of the day, and when the sort of, for example, flight patterns change, whether you're flying across the coast or locally, and you can see these patterns. You can see patterns when you're looking at, ocean currents, for example, and people can correlate those ocean currents with temperature, for example. In the study of climate science, for example, this is a very important thing. And ability to do that at a very large scale has allowed us to be able to see these kinds of correlations and patterns at a level where we could not see that before. Now the same thing is happening in the social context. So you can see behavioral patterns of people, even things like communicable diseases or propagation of disease or other kinds of behavioral changes that happens across large groups of individuals.
So one of the things I have seen, speaking of these large aggregations of data, is that there's some feeling that we are at a new inflection point, meaning things are changing. The printing press changed the world forever in an irrevocable way. The Industrial Revolution changed things in an irrevocable way. And people talk about the internet changing things, but it hasn't been as clear how. It's kind of a nice, fun thing. But the thinking that I've read would say that it's not so much the internet itself, that's just the tool. The inflection point is really the fact that we are now collecting this massive amount of data. And then in fact, we've entered what we might call the data epoch, the data age, where suddenly we're able to envision things in new ways. And the corollary, this is only not exactly the same thing, but as you know, recently scientists detected gravity waves, something long predicted by Einstein. But the significance of the gravity waves is that it allows an entirely new form of understanding the universe. And so the thinking is, in these articles that I've read, that this inflection point about the data age gives us, it's like a new set of eyes, or ears when we only had eyes, or something along those lines, where suddenly we have this entirely new dynamic for understanding ourselves and our culture and our world. Is that correct?
I think that is absolutely true. And we are seeing that. I think you're right that we are at an inflection point. And this is a sort of a convergence of the collection of the data, the ability to connect through the internet or other means that were not available before, and the technologies that allow us to actually harness this data. Because
understand it. Right?
Not just understand it, but actually be able to harness it. I mean, collecting this amount of data and then being able to actually process it. This is no easy task. Yeah. And it was really not possible to do it at that kind of a scale just a few years ago. And that's maybe one of the most, in terms of biggest changes that have been made on the technology side, is tools and frameworks, both in the software side and the hardware side, that allow us to actually do this kind of
and this is in fact your area of research, right? The tools to understand.
Well,
this.
I mean that specific aspects of it is not my area, but certainly it relates to my area. So for me to be able to do the kinds of things that I do, that data not only needs to be collected, but needs to be processed, needs to be, it's kind of like people talk about data being the new oil. I would consider big data to be kind of like crude oil. It's unrefined, right? It's dirty, and it needs to be refined, and it needs to be processed. And doing that part is really 80% of the computational work. Once you have harnessed that data, then you can apply all sorts of techniques to try to predict things and model things. But if that doesn't happen, that first step doesn't happen, You can't do any.
And is that
Many of the techniques that we use these days for making predictions really existed before. They've been around for a while.
But you couldn't get the raw material.
That's right. We could not get the data at the scale that we needed to be able to.
So is that the area
really
where the
find
greatest
patterns.
innovation is taking place, is the ability to process these gargantuan amounts of data?
I would say that that's one of the areas where some of the most advances have been made in the past, I would say, less than a decade, maybe 5 to 10 years.
And I would assume that that's both, as you mentioned, software and hardware. I mean, the hardware gets faster and faster and faster.
Sure.
But how to approach these huge stores of data, I'm sure that takes a lot of very careful scientific thinking about how do you manage all of this raw data.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, we are talking about, we are also in the age of cloud computing, right? Where this data just doesn't exist on our individual devices, but a lot of it actually exists on the cloud, so to speak, in big data centers or possibly across thousands, maybe millions of different computers that are actually accessing this data and processing it, or even storing it in a distributed way. So that's also kind of that's part of this advancement in both the physical aspects and also the software aspects that I was talking about earlier.
So this brings us to a troubling question, which is once all of this information is there and we can see things in new ways, obviously there are great benefits that could be derived from this, but being able to see things in new ways can also be used for nefarious purpose. So it seems to me that the laws and the cultural understanding have not really kept up, and that we're entering this new age kind of blind to what the implications are. So what are some of the things that we as a society should be thinking about as we enter into this new age?
Well, I think the conversations are going on already, right? So with some of the revelations of Edward Snowden, for example, we realize what is really the scope of the kind of data collection that the government is engaging, far beyond what they had claimed that they were doing or anybody imagined that they would be doing. And that included, in fact, hacking into, either getting companies to cooperate with them and actually share your private data with them, or hacking into those companies and then try to get that
Yes,
data.
unbeknownst to the companies.
That's right. And you're talking about, imagine the kind of data that just exists on your phone, right? You have your contact information, you have your, you have records of your movements, you have your conversations, you have photos these days, you have possibly health data and all sorts of other apps that
Financial
are collecting
data, all
Financial
sorts of
data, yes. And sure, there is a government could claim that, okay, there's a purpose for them to know all of this information, right? But a lot of it, I mean, what the FBI and a lot of government agencies have been, law enforcement agencies have been pushing for is really unobstructed, unrestricted access to data from anyone, not just, targeted individuals.
Or those for whom they could get a warrant.
That's right. And there's a potential.
Though in the case of that's in the news now, Apple versus the FBI, they're loggerheads. The FBI claims, of course, that it is just about one phone and one person that they're going after. And what I think is interesting is what Apple appears to be claiming is that they are being forced by the government to create something that doesn't exist, to create a new software that will bypass their own security arrangements. And that they feel that that is government overreach in that it's one thing to ask for access to data. It's another thing to ask for someone to create something that circumvents their own product. And that seems to me that's going to be a very interesting case to watch how it plays out, because it's not clear whether the government has the ability to, for example, compel you as an individual to build something in your backyard that might incriminate someone else. And that's essentially what's happening here with Apple.
That is what's happening. And basically, and it's not about just one phone. So what the government is asking, FBI is asking Apple to do essentially. One thing you have to understand that Apple and a lot of other companies that produce these kind of devices basically move the encryption to the level of individual device. That means everything that's on your phone is encrypted and you control essentially the level of privacy you want on that phone. And there is, of course, there is the default settings which are supposed to be protecting that.
Pretty strong.
This is a security measure. It's not just about privacy because you don't want other criminals to hack into your phones and steal all
Get
of
your financial data, right.
That's right. what FBI is asking essentially is for Apple to write a different operating system that doesn't have the appropriate safeguards that they have put into these phones and install it on this phone in order for them to be able to again get access to this data. And of course, if that happens, that means that particular vulnerable piece of operating system is not going to be in the world.
It exists, right.
So to me, this issue is not actually about privacy, it's about security. So FBI really is asking to create unsecure devices. And if you do that at some point, and you know that once that vulnerability is there, every hacker in the world is going to be after it trying to break it and use it. And it will happen, and most likely than not, some of those are going to be bad actors like terrorists or maybe hostile governments. So what FBI wants is, in a way, I think it's going to at some point, if they get their way, is going to come back and
haunt them. I mean, there will be, as Washington likes to say, there will be blowback, unintended consequences from their own actions.
In this case, it would be an intended consequence.
Well, yes. But the FBI would not have intended that particular consequence. One of the other things I read about this is that because what they want to do is crack this password with brute force, which is millions, trillions of iterations to try to find what the password might be. And on the computing power of the iPhone itself, that could take a decade, or at least certainly many years to run on the power of a cell phone. So what they want Apple to do is to create this software that will connect the cell phone to a supercomputer that will run all these brute force attempts in a few days, perhaps. But now you've linked the cell phone to this massive computing power that can be directly aimed at a supposedly secure device. And it seems to me that that itself is its own level of vulnerability that you've now created.
It creates all sorts of different vulnerabilities. I mean, they're not just trying to break a password in this case. They're actually trying to break an encryption. And there are obvious problems with that. Once you're able to do that, if you're able to do that,
then you can do that anywhere,
that's right,
everywhere.
Because the same encryption systems are used not just on iPhones, they're used all sorts of places. And the only thing that's really separates them is the key that's used. The difference is Apple doesn't have the key. It's the user usually that has the key as part of the actual device, and this is why they can't just
break in.
So Apple can't just go in and say, okay, here's the key, you can look at the device now, right? They have to actually modify the operating system to do it. But companies like Apple, for one thing, it gives me actually some hope that there is hope for privacy because now you have these huge, very powerful companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, etc., are actually on the side of protecting privacy because it aligns, for one thing, with their interests, and secondly, their business models. If you think about it, these companies relies on the trust that people have in allowing their data to be part of these systems. They're run on data, right? Maybe Apple a little bit less so, but I mean certainly companies like Google and Facebook and so on. So they're likely to increase protections and make the encryption even more difficult to break. And even if FBI can break into this particular phone or put in a backdoor, it's likely that the next version of iPhone or whatever that comes up is going to have even stronger encryption mechanism.
So this idea of encryption and protecting things brings to mind stories that I'm sure you've seen about cars that can be hacked remotely via wireless transmission. Someone with a laptop in the neighborhood cafe can hack the operating system of the car you're driving and disable the steering, disable the brakes. So this level of encryption that we're talking about seems to me that it's going to be applicable to, or it may become the case where everybody, car manufacturers, the thermostat manufacturers, the so-called Internet of Things, the smart refrigerator, all these things may have to come with encryption.
Absolutely.
That cannot be broken.
So security becomes far more important than it used to be because every device, every locomotive, every car is going to have, is going to be connected, and it's going to have systems that are potentially vulnerable and could be manipulated.
And what is interesting to me is that, coming back to the idea of big data and the magnitude of the number of sensors that are now around the world and I'm sure the growth and the deployment of sensors probably follows a logarithmic curve as well. That this inflection point of data where everything's going to be connected and everything's going to be feeding data to multiple cloud databases, essentially creates a new organism. There is this new entity in the world that is composed of data and all the things that go along with that data. And in order for that new organism to survive, it seems that it would have to develop things like an immune system or some sort of protection. Our bodies have evolved over many millions of years to protect against invasion, to protect against breakdown. And it seems to me that the encryption is part of that immune system.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. You're going to need an immune system in order to be able to survive in that kind of environments where there is lots of threats against you. And it's both about forcing or not allowing foreign objects to break in, or let's say microbes or other
pathogens
bad
of some
actors,
sort,
pathogens to break in. But it's also about building robust systems that actually, even if you break in, or even if in the face of bad actors being part of the system itself can actually continue to function and do its work.
And so how, that's not necessarily encryption, how does that work? How do you build these resilient systems?
Well, that comes down to more about algorithms and sometimes hardware, right? So if you have systems that are redundant, for example, that if one server goes down, you have other servers that are going to pick up. So that's one way of making systems more robust. If you have algorithms that can accomplish their task, even in the face of attacks, where the people are trying to manipulate the underlying data that the algorithm works on, that's another form of robustness.
So one of the technologies that we read a lot about is the Bitcoin, which relies on highly distributed, essentially it's like a ledger, the old ledgers we were talking about that people used to write in, but it's distributed amongst millions of computers. And that in itself develops a form of resilience, doesn't it? Because now the information you need to verify a Bitcoin, in order to change it, you'd have to change it on those millions of computers.
That's right, yeah. So that's actually, that's kind of the model that makes Bitcoins work, right?
Right. So as we go forward, what should individuals be thinking of, particularly I think in the light of the Apple case? We all carry cell phones now, we all have smartphones. We're increasingly wiring our houses. What sorts of things should we as individuals be thinking about?
Well, I think people need to be worried about both privacy and also security. The problem is, right now people have been, at least people in the United States, I think, are being conditioned not to worry about that. And part of it is not because government want us to do that, or some companies want us to do that, but because we are in a kind of environment that it benefits us sometimes to share some of this data because you get something out of it, right? You share all of your contacts, and then you get connected
you find
in
a restaurant.
different ways. You find a restaurant, yeah. So I think people need to be able to kind of worry about that aspect of the privacy.
Well, on that note, we'll leave people shivering in their chairs, wondering what to do next. Bamshad, it's been a pleasure having you on the show again. I'm sure we'll have you back again. This is a topic that will continue to evolve as we go on.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you for being a guest. And thank you for being our viewers tonight on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. We've been visiting with Professor Bamshad Mobasher from DePaul University. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19 and on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.